It is proposals to create 4 new cities in Cobb County, and it is raising questions about politics and about timing.
County leadership flipped from red to blue in the last election. Some believe the push for new cities could be an attempt to reclaim some of the power now in the hands of Democrats. 11 Alive's Doug Richards takes a look.
Lost Mountain is a popular park run by Cobb County's government. Next year, the park could be the centerpiece for a new city of Lost Mountain, a bedroom community west of Marietta. Jenny Earhart thinks it's time.
Essentially what this, Doug, is all about is local control and the belief that people who live in a certain community should be able to make decisions about that community.
Currently, Lost Mountain has representation on the Cobb County Board of Commissioners, which flipped from Republican to Democratic control in the 2020 election. But Lost Mountain is an area of Cobb that did not flip. Eric Allen thinks cityhood now is no coincidence.
I think it's more of a reaction to the 2020 election, more so than kind of a long-term strategy or thought process of what needs to be done.
Is this a reaction to Democrats winning the control of the Cobb County Commission?
No, not at all. In fact, it is a reaction to a difference, I guess, of opinion on what positive, effective development looks like.
Though Cobb County already has several cities, Marietta is the largest, much of Cobb is still unincorporated. The proposed city of Lost Mountain would take a swath of land west of Marietta. The cities of Mableton, Vinings, and East Cobb would consume much of what remains of unincorporated Cobb.
There's a lot of questions and a lot of emotion about this issue, understandably.
New cities are often contentious, with implications for change at the neighborhood level.
This is about local control.
And some of these cities are not offering many more services than my HOA office right now.
If the legislature approves the Cobb cityhood bills next session, voters within each proposed boundary would have to approve it. And Earhart thinks voters will get those questions as early as next spring.